The speech I want to explore with you today is perhaps the single most famous gathering of wisdom in all of Shakespeare's plays. It also represents one person's conscious effort to transmit wisdom to someone he loves in a kind of lesson. And those features are making a claim on our attention in the colloquium. They also make what Polonius says to Laertes very different from the passages that we've discussed earlier. Theseus, Richard, and Duke Senior don't so much gather and transmit wisdom as they perform or demonstrate a capacity for reflection. Julia and I have been referring to those speeches as essays in order to draw your attention to their affinity for a genre that is especially congenial to open-ended contemplations of wisdom. In the English tradition, the modern essay is born in the 18th century when new printing technologies and the expansion of literacy, the growth of periodicals, and real skepticism about the value of ancient knowledge results in a new form of writing, generally in prose, that separates itself from autobiography and erudite commentary on classical texts and the sermon. Now, having said that, the essay in English had a long gestation, and it was partly from Seneca's letters, Plutarch's writings about customs and manners, and Montaigne's wide-ranging meditations on his reading and life experiences that Shakespeare learned how to develop the style of thinking that we have been admiring. And that style, I think, is characterized by a strong individual voice, grace of expression, sensitivity to language, imaginative use of metaphor, a habit of unfolding through associative leaps rather than logical arguments, and above all, by a sense of exploration and discovery, specifically self-discovery. The case is somewhat different with Polonius. He speaks wisely, but he sounds different from our other speakers, as you will discover in a little while. And one reason for that difference is that Shakespeare is using Polonius's speech to bring wisdom into focus in a compressed or undiluted state that the Renaissance especially cherished. And that form of wisdom is the proverb, or the adage, or the sentence, or the aphorism. I'll probably use all of those terms today synonymously. Seneca's letters testify that proverbs played a role in the education of children from antiquity, and also in the preparation of adults who wished to join a school of philosophy. To join a school or a philosophical community meant adopting a way of life that embraced the distinctive teachings of the school's founders. And sententiae, which is just a Latin word that means opinions or judgments about something, sententiae made core teachings memorable, connecting initiates in the school to more advanced members of the community. And here is a passage in which Seneca is reflecting on sentences in that regard. I'm sure sententiae do a great deal for beginners and listeners from outside the school. He's referring to the school of Stoicism. That is why we give children proverbs to memorize. They are what a child's mind is able to encompass, not yet having room for anything larger. So at some point before the 5th century AD, a collection of approximately 200 proverbs was compiled under the title Cato's Distichs, probably by a grammar teacher. A distich is a couplet, and this collection also included monostichs, which are one-liners. The book came to be known simply as Cato, and it enjoyed widespread popularity as a Latin textbook and as an introduction to ethics into the 18th century. Benjamin Franklin printed an English translation of Cato in 1735. Here's a copy in the collection of the University of Pennsylvania. Now, the grammarian who compiled Cato presents his work as a gift to his son and as a guide to human flourishing. Here is an excerpt from the preface to Cato. Would someone like to read this? I'll take a volunteer. And I can't see you so well because my full screen is the slideshow. So Julia, maybe you can pick somebody.
If Carol McGorky is here, he's a very good reader. Carol, are you here? Would you mind reading this?
Okay, it's unfamiliar text, but I'll try. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
When I saw how many stray from the path of good conduct, I decided to help them live gloriously and attain honor. Now, beloved son, I will teach you how to compose a rule for living. Therefore, read my precepts, precepta, so that you understand them. For to read, leggere, and not understand, non intellegere, is to be negligent, neglegere.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And you'll see that in the green text on your screen, I have shown that to read, to understand, and to be negligent all have the root verb to read in them. So the Latin is really pounding home the reading in all sorts of ways, that the most important thing that the owner of the book can do, the grammarian's own son, is to read the precepts. Here is a selection of precepts from the section of monastics, and I've chosen them for their relevance to Polonius's speech, as you can see in this slide. Read books, remember what you read, know your place, or preserve a sense of shame, depending on how you translate it. Be gentle, but be angry for a serious cause. Practice virtue. Cato's precepts are, so rudimentary that it can be difficult to fathom how this book earned the enduring international popularity that it did in ancient through Enlightenment schools. And I think it's even harder for us moderns to appreciate the kind of faith that highly educated people during these centuries placed in proverbial wisdom like this when they grew to adulthood. And yet there is every reason to believe that their faith was genuine. I'm not suggesting that proverbial wisdom was a set of dogmatic beliefs that people felt compelled to obey. Rather, I'm saying that proverbs served the people who cherished them as touchstones for their experiences, or as points of access to a wider and sympathetic human community, and as patterns rather than laws for self-understanding. Seneca argues that truth belongs to everybody. He says that ancients are not our masters, but our guides. He encourages original thinking and believes that the mark of philosophical maturity is to make new discoveries and to coin new proverbs about those discoveries. And yet, when he comes to reflect on the benefits of philosophy in a text called On the Shortness of Life, he underscores that proverbial wisdom from the past is a uniquely precious legacy available to everyone. He says that people who make time for philosophy annex every age to their own, and that unless we are devoid of gratitude, those brilliant framers of sacred sayings were born for us and prepared a life for us. I think this is the spirit in which Erasmus made the gathering, elucidation, and publication of proverbial wisdom the cornerstone of his scholarship as a Christian humanist in the 16th century. Here you see him in Holbein's famous painting. The book of Ecclesiastes says that the words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. But for Erasmus, the essence of proverbial wisdom is fellowship. Between 1500 and his death in the 1530s, Erasmus collected over 4,000 proverbs from classical and biblical texts in a wildly popular anthology known as the Adagia. Here is the title page of the 4th edition from 1520, which is a special favorite of mine. At the bottom of the frame there, you see a garden, which is an evocation of the setting of many of the colloquies that Erasmus wrote on ethical topics. And above the garden, in a series of galleries, Greek and Latin writers engage in a lively conversation. In Erasmus's conception, proverbial wisdom is an ongoing dialogue between philosophers and theologians and historians and poets from different places, different periods, different cultures, different belief systems, And that's a conversation that readers of the book are invited to join by learning the proverbs for themselves. Here's how Erasmus defines a proverb. A proverb is a saying in popular use, remarkable for some shrewd or novel turn. That has got to be the understatement of the 16th century, given the singular value that he assigned to proverbial wisdom. Erasmus valued proverbs as distillations of complex philosophical and religious doctrines from antiquity. He believed that as societies rose and fell over time, proverbs were uniquely capable of preserving the essence of humanity's search for the truth, and also of its hard-won achievements in that regard. He believed that under the right conditions, whole schools of thought, faith traditions, and cultural mores could be resurrected from proverbs. And I guess they were for him the DNA of forms of flourishing ethical life that had long since become unviable through mutations or gone extinct altogether by being forgotten. For example, in his comment on the Pythagorean proverb with which he opens the Adagia, you see it here, friends hold all things in common, Erasmus derived the insight that the fundamental purpose not only of Plato's philosophy, but also of Christian theology was the promotion of love and friendship. You see what an ocean of philosophy, or rather of theology, is opened up to us in this tiny proverb, he wrote. And here is Erasmus rejoicing again in the value of proverbs in his edition of Cato from the early 16th century. I'm showing you a passage from an English translation. So what I'll call your attention to here is that from Erasmus's perspective, Cato is not only a book for children learning Latin and good manners in school. For him, Cato is also a boon companion, what the period called a vade mecum, something to come along with me. It was a manual to be held in the hand, if you can see me holding this book, or a bosom book to be worn next to the heart in a pocket inside your jacket, and it belonged to everybody. So Erasmus so thoroughly believed in the power of proverbs to transform perspective and behavior that he urged readers of Cato to incorporate the contents of the book into the design of their homes and their armorial crests and badges. I'll read this one. This is a further excerpt from that preface. He that will have good and godly poesies, that is verses, and titles, either in his arms, badges, cognizances, or in the borders of his hangings, meaning his tapestries, in this book may he have them, which be right worthy to be graven and written in golden letters, or if there be anything, more precious. Right? So in other words, he is encouraging readers of Cato not only to internalize proverbial wisdom as reference points for their life's journey, he's also urging them to dwell with it by turning the places that they inhabit into the pages of an enormous book of wisdom. And I know of one writer who took up this advice, or maybe he had the idea for himself. Here is a photograph of the ceiling in Montaigne's library. Each supporting column and crossbeam in this large room is decorated with proverbs, meaning that wherever Montaigne sat as he wrote his essays, there would be a sight line back to the sentences from which he took his bearings as a reader, a writer, a husband, a father, a magistrate, a neighbor, and so forth. And in general, the proverbs that Montaigne chose for his library reflect his commitment to skepticism and to humility, most of all, as an intellectual virtue. Here is a quick translation of the proverbs you could see in that photo. I'm not going to dwell on them, but the point would be that they humble the intellect and they're drawn from a wide range of texts, Old Testament, New Testament, Greek philosophy, Greek literature. So in England, Erasmus's advocacy of proverbial wisdom gave rise to a variety of homegrown anthologies for different age groups and occasions and life circumstances. I'll mention just two. This is the School of Virtue, the little Polonius-like man on the front. School of Virtue is a free imitation of Cato's distichs that combines proverbs in verse with prayers as it accompanies young readers through a typical day from sunrise to nightfall. And along the way, it addresses such topics as how to talk and when not to talk, how to dress, how to behave at home, in the street, at school, in church, how to recognize and make friends with good people, and how to avoid bad people, and so forth. For adults, there were books such as the Treatise of Moral Philosophy, a huge harvest containing the sayings of the wise, wherein you may see the worthy and pithy sayings of philosophers, emperors, kings, and orators, and so forth. Between 1547 and 1631, the treatise appeared in more than 20 editions, ever growing, ever expanding, and that's very strong evidence of its appeal. Thomas Palfreyman, who's the editor of the volume in the edition that you see here, explains that he became involved with the book after seeing a copy in the hand of his very friend wherewith he was passing the time. Palfreyman borrowed the book from his friend and fell very much in love with the precepts, godly counsels, and wise sayings that he found in it. And then, thinking that the gifts of the Spirit of God are given to every man to no other use but to edify withal, lovingly to help one another, to comfort and encourage one another, and every man to rejoice at another's well-doing, Palfreyman resolved to continue the work of gathering and publishing proverbs in order to extend the friendship of ancient wisdom and the fellowship of wise readers, of which his love for his very friend was also a part, to every reader of the treatise. And I'm pausing over this book because there's no book from the period that I study that I know that more clearly or movingly presents the transmission of proverbial wisdom as an expanding circle of love and generosity. Now, I'm sure you recognize that of all the plays that Shakespeare wrote, Hamlet has probably had the most lasting impact on the way we think, speak, and write. It's thanks to this tragedy that we say the time is out of joint when we want to refer to the problems of modern life. And brevity is the soul of wit when we're bored by a long-winded speaker. And there's method in my madness when other people question the sanity of our choices. And it smells to heaven when we're offended by hypocrisy or other moral failings, and sick at heart when we're sad and anxious. In other words, there is a sententious texture to Shakespeare's language in this play that generations of readers and audiences have made their own. And this is especially true of Polonius' speech to Laertes. Perhaps the sententiousness of this tragedy explains what Gabriel Harvey, who was a Cambridge Don, is talking about in the earliest comment about Hamlet that we have. The younger sort takes much delight in Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, but his Lucrece and his tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, have it in them to please the wiser sort. The first quarto edition of Hamlet from 1603 provides clearer evidence that the proverbial wisdom in the play was recognized and valued. Here is the way that Polonius' speech looks in Q1, where Polonius is called Carambus. Along the left-hand margin of the text toward the bottom of the page, scare quotes alert the tragedy's readers to the presence not of someone else's intellectual property, but to wise sentences that belong to us all. And possibly these scare quotes were meant to encourage readers to copy these lines into a commonplace book, where the harvest of one's reading could be organized for further reflection and then for use in composition and in life. Now, the last thing I will say before asking my friend Patty Gallagher, professor of theater arts at UC Santa Cruz, to read the speech is that I've leaned really hard on the philanthropic aspect of proverbial wisdom today and on the high esteem in which early centuries held proverbs so that we can have a chance of giving Polonius a fair hearing. And you might not be aware of how slim those chances actually are, because long-standing critical and theatrical traditions have taught us over and over again that Polonius is more of a fool than a wise man. And here is an image that will have to stand in for all of those traditions, which I can't say much about today. This is Polonius, mansplaining his way into a very tender moment between his children in a typically 19th century illustration of our scene. The author of the first essay about Hamlet, which was published in 1736, argued that it is evident by the whole tenor of Polonius's behavior that he is intended to represent some buffoonish statesman. And in the next century, Samuel Taylor Coleridge said that Polonius is a man of maxims, adding that a man of maxims only is like a cyclops with one eye, and that eye in the back of his head. It's not very flattering, is it? Now, on the other hand, these writers make a clear distinction between the value of what Polonius says to Laertes and the foolhardy way in which he tends to behave in the play. The critic who called Polonius a buffoon in 1736 praised his grave and excellent instructions, writing that Shakespeare was too good a judge to design anything comic or buffoonish upon so solemn an occasion as that of a son's taking leave of his father. And Coleridge judged Polonius to be admirable when descanting on matter of past experience, as in that excellent speech to Laertes. Even as recently as 1946, the critic Logan Pearsall Smith, whom I quite like as a writer about Shakespeare, he could invoke the contrast between a shallow-pated Polonius and the profound wisdom that he imparts to his son. In contrast to this way of thinking about things, I think it has become the norm since the 60s for academics and directors to interpret what Polonius says as further evidence of his foolishness, as though there were no value in what he's saying to Laertes, and also no difference between a proverb and a truism. Polonius is a very sententious man, and our task today is to think about the meaning of sententiousness as an aspect of living well. When Shakespeare calls someone sententious, it's always in praise. He only uses that word 4 times. For example, "By my faith," says Duke Senior of his jester Touchstone, "he is very swift and sententious." In Shakespeare's lifetime, sententious referred primarily to a plenitude of wit in a person or a text. But according to the Oxford English Dictionary, that definition started to become obsolete in the second half of the 17th century. Between 1700 and 1900, sententious came to have negative connotations. For example, a sententious style or discourse is now thought to be affected or pompous or excessively formal. And to call a person sententious is not to say that he is wise or intelligent, but rather that he is inclined to load his speech and writing with aphorisms from a compulsion to assert a moral authority that he hasn't earned. So, having made you aware of our modern bias against Polonius's sententiousness, I'm hoping that you can set it aside while you listen to Patty read the speech.
"Yet here, Laertes, aboard, for shame. The wind sits in the shoulder of your sail, and you are stayed for. There, my blessing with thee, and these few precepts in thy memory look thou character. Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. Those friends thou hast and their adoption tried, grapple them unto thy soul with hoops of steel, but do not dull thy palm with entertainment of each new-hatched, unfledged comrade. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Costly thy habit, as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy. Rich, not gaudy, for the apparel oft proclaims the man, and they in France of the best rank and station are the most select and generous, chief in that. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell. My blessing season this in thee. The time invites you. Go. Your servants tend.
Thank you so much, Patty. That's fantastic. Here is the speech that Patty just read, and I'll point out a few things about it and then open the floor for discussion. The speech is 27 lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter. There is a brief preamble, which you see here in green, followed by a half line that I take to be the opening frame of the speech proper. Here in line 56 and again in line 80, Polonius refers to what he is bestowing on Laertes as a blessing. And I think we ought to take that word seriously. An older man and a widower and his only son say goodbye as the latter departs on an ocean voyage. For me, the possibility that they may not see each other alive again, and indeed they don't, hovers over the exchange and informs what's happening. I feel a kind of nervousness and urgency in Polonius's repetition of that word blessing. It's one mark of the seriousness and the tenderness of what's happening here between father and son. And the simplicity and respectfulness of Laertes' response to Polonius is another. Most humbly, do I take my leave, my lord, he says when Polonius stops talking. Next, Polonius urges Laertes to remember his gift of proverbs. He uses a metaphor that Hamlet also uses in the play, namely that the brain is a book in which reading and experience are written down. The word character here literally refers to writing, but it also draws attention to Polonius's desire to say something that will inform the man Laertes becomes far from home. And here is the heart of the speech. 9 proverbs or sentences, all in the imperative mood. And I've put them in alternating colors so that you can make them out. And also in this list, which makes it even clearer where they are. Now, suppose we approach the speech without assuming that we're meant to laugh at Polonius as a supercilious old man spouting truisms to a son who is impatient to be on his way. Suppose we read it as lovers and seekers of wisdom. What then are these proverbs about, and what kind of blessing is this? That's what I hope we'll talk about today, and I'll offer you a few notes to get us started. So reading the speech again over the weekend, I noticed that the 1st and 5th proverbs both start with the verb give. They also share a concern with what we might call the decorum of inner life. These sentences are encouragements to be discreet and moderate and judicious in thought, in word, in deed. And for Polonius, those virtues are related to the capacity to listen to other people. In the 2nd, 4th, and 7th proverbs, the topic of decorum is carried into the sphere of social relations. These sentences emphasize the necessity of finding one's place in society and also of maintaining it by behaving or performing in the right way. The 2nd proverb recognizes that a willingness to extend oneself to others is an important part of belonging to a society. It also points to the risk of not maintaining boundaries between oneself and others. The 4th proverb acknowledges that inevitably one will be drawn into disputes, and it recommends behaving in such a way that will reduce the likelihood of quarreling in the future. The 3rd and 8th proverbs refer both directly and indirectly to a really vast literature about friendship stemming from Aristotle, Cicero, and Seneca. These sentences register the high value that Renaissance ethics placed on friendship as an elective human bond, and they acknowledge the importance of good judgment, not only in making, but also in keeping one's friends. The 8th proverb implies that the wrong kind of giving and receiving can imperil a friendship and also become an impediment to one's own flourishing. The 6th proverb, which is a variation of the one immediately before it, says that we should be more willing to receive criticism than to give it. And I think you could also interpret this proverb as a reminder that when we expose ourselves to criticism, our power and responsibility to scrutinize ourselves remain intact. And finally, the ninth proverb, which is the most famous one in the whole speech. I think it's a synthesis of the spirit of all the others, in the sense that it harmonizes the project of self-development with the performance of one's duty to others. And I'm very grateful to Julia for showing me these lines in that context. So I'll conclude by saying that it's true that Polonius's wise sayings do not protect him from barking up the wrong tree with Hamlet's madness, or from being in the wrong place at the wrong time in Gertrude's bedroom. And his blessing does not inoculate Laertes against the grief and anger that consume him later in the play. But does that mean that proverbial wisdom is nothing more than what Hamlet says it is? Words, words, words. I acknowledge that this play is very, very skeptical about our ability to live wisely. But I think to assume that proverbs must be foolproof in order to have value would be seriously to misunderstand how wisdom could be fitted to human folly as a therapy and not a cure. And it would also be to misunderstand the human condition itself. And with that, I am delighted to open the floor to discussion. What's been happening in the chat? Oh, thanks.
That was great, Sean. Really, really appreciate that. And also thank you, Patty, for sharing that with us.
Can I speak?
Yes, please, Eleanor. How are you?
I'll buy everything except for the one, number 9. It's a complete invalidation of the Judeo-Christian concept, which is love God and love your neighbor. And he says, to your own self be true. Well, I'm old enough that I've known plenty of people who were true to themselves and were the nicest word is screw ups. Yeah. And, so that's why all the bad things happen, is because he really believes number 9. And I mean, he's working for the wrong guy. Nobody makes the same error as Macbeth, namely marrying somebody and doesn't want to have his own heir. Mm-hmm. Gertrude's on the way out. Hamlet's on the way out. Hamlet knows it. Hamlet's not mad. Hamlet's smart. But of course, there's no one to talk to other than himself. But yeah.
So do I understand you correctly, Eleanor, that you think that the 9th proverb asserts the good of self-interest as against the good of a sort of more philanthropic approach to others, and that's the flaw in the ointment?
Yes, that's a little bit of an understatement. I mean, I think he's self-obsessive is what he is. And that's what the phrase is.
Polonius.
And the phrase indicates that you're self-obsessive. Maybe Polonius isn't, but that the phrase is, if you're going to take that face value, you're going to be self-obsessive. To your own
I have some thoughts about that, but I wonder if someone from the group would like to counter-argue. But I have some thoughts about that.
That's okay.
I think it's great. It's a great commentary.
Can you?
And, I think a lot of it has to do with reading subjectively this dictum in a manner that for Polonius and for Shakespeare's age, there would have been a strong objective reading. Regina, did you want to respond to that?
Sure, or throw my thoughts in. I think it's a very noble to thine own self be true, because one doesn't want to compromise one's own integrity, and you have to be confident and aware of yourself before you can help others. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't take, to me, it doesn't challenge the Judeo-Christian or ethical, even if you're if you on a secular level, just being kind to others, you can still do that, but as long as you're not compromising your own ethics, your own integrity in trying to bend over backwards for everybody and losing yourself in the process and becoming a shadow as opposed to maintaining your individuality and personhood. Anyway. It's sort of a stream of consciousness for me.
Beautiful.
Comment?
Please.
Yes, go ahead.
To thine own self be true presupposes that one knows oneself. So that's quite a high standard.
That's a good point. So that self-knowledge is the first task, which is the Socratic dictum that has to precede then being true to that self. Sean, do you have ideas? I mean, there's lots of great stuff in the chat here as well.
Yeah.
Around this issue.
Well, one thing I would say is that it's a very enigmatic recommendation, which I think is one of the reasons why it escapes from the ring fence of the play and enters the English of subsequent periods, right? The question of what it means to be true to the self, right, is exactly what we're talking about here. And you see that it admits of very different opinions. I think that's the essence of how Erasmus, anyway, understood proverbial wisdom, right? It was, a point of contact with a vast network of perspectives, for example, here on self-knowledge, that were not reducible to one perspective, but had a certain amount of play and conflict and back and forth between them. Now, as for Polonius himself, I would say that, consider the origin of this speech. He's a courtier talking to a son who he imagines will become a courtier. And he's trying, I think, to balance career advice, career utility, right, as a courtier, with something like moral backbone, right, or ethical behavior. He's trying to find a way of passing on both a kind of utilitarian courtier's logic and a somewhat more humane, ethical thinking to his son at the same time. And it's not surprising to me that we feel the strain that Eleanor is pointing to, right, or a strain like that. The play does put a huge amount of pressure on ethical conduct, right? And, Hamlet says 2 scenes later when he encounters the ghost and the ghost tells him what's going on, assuming that that's not a hallucination. Hamlet says, that's it. I'm erasing my commonplace book. I'm throwing away all saws, all wise sayings, all aphorisms, and everything I've copied down to remember as a point of conduct, because the world doesn't make sense anymore, right? The only thing I'm going to remember from now on is what the ghost told me. So, I think one of the challenges for audiences of the tragedy are, especially modern audiences of the tragedy, is to try to think about what could be rescued from the play as wisdom when the play is really putting a back-cracking pressure on the whole concept of wisdom to begin with. And all that I can recommend to you is that bad quarto page that I showed you, where at least in the early 17th century, the publisher of that edition of the play thought that it was possible to take something meaningful out of the play, separate it from all of its skepticism, and be put to other uses. What those uses might be are not prescribed.
We have some great comments here. One person indicates, I think this is Jessica Howland, that we often take that line to thine own self be true and not complete it. Jessica, do you want to comment on that? If you can unmute yourself, or I'll read your comment. Jessica says here, the next line is that you'll be true to others to the extent that you've learned. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, because to me, the 2 lines go together. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like how nowadays it's popular to say you can't love others until you love yourself. That sort of idea that, if whatever you are as a person to yourself is what teaches you to do that to others. Mm-hmm. So I take those 2, thine own self be true, that I take it that it goes with the next line, that it's, as night follows day, obviously, then you'll be able to be true to other people.
Right. I think what Eleanor is pointing out is that there's a tendency within the play itself to separate one line from the other.
Yeah.
to subjectivize and isolate and intensify those elements of Hamlet that we associate with a kind of radical individualism, but that the original proverb exists in a more shared and communal and collective space of shared wisdom, as Sean was kind of building out for us with this proverbial tradition.
Julia, can we ask Abby Heald's question? If Polonius, if Polonius's proverbs are objectively good, then why is he so commonly viewed as a buffoon, a cyclops that can only see backwards? And why do we have such a prejudice against proverbs? Abby, do you want to say a few words about that yourself as someone who teaches Hamlet quite a lot?
No.
Well,
No. I mean, I've been sitting here trying to think about why it is that we think they're simple-minded. I mean, every proverb you cited, especially the ones from Montaigne, I want to write on my own wall. So why do we think he is simple-minded?
I think what he says suffers so profoundly from what happens to him. I mean, Polonius has character problems. Can we acknowledge that? He sets his daughter as bait to work out his crazy theory that Hamlet is mad because he hasn't been able to marry Ophelia. A couple of scenes after the one I talked about today, Polonius sends a servant after Laertes to Paris to try to trick Laertes into behaving badly, to see whether he's really living according to these and other precepts that Polonius has asked him. And then he is a monomaniac when it comes to his theory about why Hamlet is mad. So, you know, I think the play does mean for us to laugh at him. But I also think part of the challenge of the play is to evaluate what you do with authoritative pronouncements from the past, from these precepts all the way up to the ghost, right? Both these proverbs and the ghost are sort of the past come to life in a certain way in the play. And from what position would it mean to accept, embrace, or reject any of them? But I do think that the pre-19th century critical tradition, to the extent that I have read around in it, shows that there was a capacity to think about Polonius in a number of different ways that have long since sort of withered away in our critical and performance traditions. Patty, you played Polonius as Polonia a few years ago at Santa Cruz Shakespeare. Do you want to comment on what that was like to be this character?
Sure. And also, I feel like it is. I'm really glad you're talking about just the sort of the complexity of how we see Polonius, because this speech, the actually of this speech, is that thing that you were talking about, the goodbye, is, I feel, as important as anything. So in addition to a sort of a small little speech, the goodbye at the end, I think, is really important. The things that I feel were complicated about playing Polonius were the stereotypes that we have about buffoon, and that Polonius is really is a character inherited from commedia traditions of the old man. And so in some senses, he's a sort of a stock character that shows up and we have to give like a plumb line of truth to. I feel like I was always sort of fighting that situation. A thing that we didn't really talk about here too is that between the goodbye, darling Laertes, and the immediately shift to what the hell is going on with Ophelia is a very sharp one. And so, however, this sort of, even if you find the depth and the fatherly, or in that sense, motherly situation, the difference in the treatment of the children is fascinating. The thing I also want to say about Polonius that connects him to other of Shakespeare's characters, particularly the clown-like characters, is that we often see real wisdom and real pathos in the package of someone we're supposed to laugh at. And I think about, for instance, the circumstance of Laertes in Two Gentlemen of Verona, who was in truly of a painful and high stakes situation. At a certain point in the play, Launce will come out and say, like, I know I'm supposed to be an idiot, but I think my master's doing something really bad. And so I feel like we often see Shakespeare's sort of comic or clown characters speaking truth. So I guess in my attack at playing, it was always to try to find the truth and to pay attention to sort of verbal tics and wit that comedy could come out of.
Brad, sorry, that was great, Patty. Thank you. Brad Crenshaw is asking if indeed something is rotten in Denmark, and where might social wisdom be enacted, or how might wisdom be defined? I agree with Abby. That's a tremendous question. One of the things that Julia has taught me over the years is that even in a scorched earth tragedy like Hamlet or King Lear, there is something that begins to push up, from the wreckage. A new life form comes out. And I would say in this play, if you wanted to argue that Polonius's blessing is not totally wasted on Laertes, I would look at the moment where Laertes seeks forgiveness and friendship from Hamlet at the end of the play. I mean, they've killed each other. Laertes realizes he's on the way out. He tells the truth, at least the truth that he knows, which is Claudius's involvement in the plot against Hamlet. And he seeks forgiveness and gives forgiveness, right? They become friends in the last moments of their life. Now, is that an enactment of social wisdom that we, want to embrace? Well, it's better than nothing. I mean, because the alternative in these plays is really nothing with a capital N, just the elimination of all things that would make a life worth living. But that at least sends into the future, maybe through Horatio, who's going to now take the stage and retell the story to Fortinbras, maybe what Laertes and Hamlet do together in that moment that Horatio witnesses is create what Seneca would call a new discovery, right? And that a new proverb will come from that, and a new wisdom will be transmitted so that this doesn't happen again. But that's very optimistic thinking. But I think there are some ways in which you can think about that last thing that Laertes does as evidence that the impress of Polonius's blessing took effect. To thine own self be true, and it must follow as the day that thou canst not be false to any man. He decides to go out not being false to any man. So, Julia, do you see anything else in there?
Well, there's a lot of great stuff here. David Shapiro says that without necessarily being aware of the sources, he's tried to raise our children to abide by the principles that we have discussed in the last two meetings. So that's really beautiful to hear. There's also a question about Eastern wisdom and Western wisdom there's so many comments here. Sorry. But maybe the person who posed that would like to unmute for a second and comment, because that's something I'll try to talk about a little bit next week when I talk about Cleopatra and kind of broaden wisdom traditions while remaining within Shakespeare's sphere, try to broaden wisdom traditions to the East, to Egypt and beyond. So I think that's an important framework to bring in here. And then Eli Simon has a comment here about Polonius being self-referential. Remember what I've taught you, and don't forget the truths I've passed on to you, right? This element of vidor lador, from generation to generation. That's what you are made of, and that's who you are. You are, after all, my son. And that sense of blessing, I see very much. I love what you had to say about blessing, Sean, which I think is a very important form of speech in Shakespeare at both the micro level and then, sort of more largely in terms of beats or movements in some of the plays. Mm-hmm. And that the sense of like the blessings of the patriarchs on their deathbeds and also in other moments seems to be kind of echoing here. So the sense of the intergenerational that you also, we have the friendship, which is very much a relationship between equals, even if they're across time. But then we also have this intergenerational transmission, which is also across time, but is a little less founded on equality.
Thinking a little bit more about what Eleanor said to start us off, I loved that fiery comment. And I would just say, maybe it's a further response to what you said, that if it is true that what Shakespeare is dwelling on here toward the end of this list of precepts is ancient friendship theory, right? That's pre-Christian theory, especially he's getting it from Cicero, right? Cicero's De Amicitia, which is a dialogue which transmits a lot of Aristotle's ethical writing about friendship. It was a set text in the Renaissance school that he attended, in many Renaissance schools. He would not have been able to find in ancient friendship theory the idea that to be true to oneself was to sacrifice oneself utterly for others, right? Self-sacrifice in that sense, or altruism in that sense of extreme self-sacrifice, really is not part of Cicero's vocabulary. Cicero believes that friendship, which he regards as the highest form of human intimacy between equals, is, I don't want to call it a machine, but that's the word that occurs to me. It's a machine for producing human flourishing for two people, right? It's a relationship in which both partners recognize what the highest good is for the other and devote themselves to helping that person achieve that good. Now, in Cicero's context, that means an aristocratic male climbing the ladder of political offices in the Republic until he becomes a person like Cicero and Cicero's friends, a statesman, right? And I think, it's hard to filter that out for me reading Polonius, right? I think Polonius is trying to help Laertes get on that cursus honorum, that ladder of honors, to get to a place where he too is a counselor to a king, the chief counselor to a king. And so that element of self-development, which to us looks very selfish if our view of altruism is the crucifixion, right? Is perhaps not so selfish if you think how pre-Christian and sort of ancient Roman it is in its origin. Just a thought.
Well, it's 12:56, Sean, and that's kind of a beautiful place to end. Next week, we're going to be talking about a speech by Cleopatra. I wanted to make sure we had some female voices at our wisdom table as well. And I'll be sending out information about that along with today's recording once I gather those items together. Sean, any final departing words? And then you and I will stick around a little, and Patty, I hope as well, for a few extra minutes for anyone who has questions or comments.
Go forth and write on your walls. I want to see proverbs on all those walls next week when we assemble for Julia's talk about Antony and Cleopatra.